Well, today, the United States Supreme Court granted Donald Trump immunity for conduct described in exactly 2 paragraphs of a 130-paragraph indictment. The rest of the indictment against Donald Trump still stands as of tonight. And the Supreme Court has ordered the trial judge in the case, Tanya Chutkan, to hear testimony in the case from a very long list of potential witnesses to clarify if some of the remaining charges in the indictment might now fit into a new category created by the Supreme Court today, granting criminal immunity for some presidential conduct. That could lead Judge Chutkan to, in effect, be presiding over an examination of the evidence similar to or equal to what would occur in the prosecution in the trial, the actual trial of this case, when Prosecutor Jack Smith would be calling his prosecution witnesses to the witness stand in Judge Chutkan's courtroom, including Mike Pence, to take an oath and testify under oath to prove to the judge that the conduct described in the rest of the indictment is in no way immune from prosecution, even with the Supreme Court's new definition today. Unlike a trial, Donald Trump does not have to be present for that hearing, which could last weeks, so it would in no way interfere with his presidential campaign. The 6-3 decision identified 2 different fears on each side of that decision in the Supreme Court. The majority of the justices seem to fear a president living under the pressure of unreasonable criminal prosecutions, even though that has never happened in the history of the country. And the minority of the justices fear a president they now see as, in effect, sanctioned to break the law. The majority called the minority's view, quote, fear-mongering on the basis of extreme hypotheticals about a future where the president feels empowered to violate federal criminal law. What the majority saw without today's ruling, this is what they fear, is, quote, the more likely prospect of an executive branch that cannibalizes itself with each successive president free to prosecute his predecessors, yet unable to boldly and fearlessly carry out his duties for fear that he may be next. Never mind that no president has ever, in any sense, prosecuted his predecessor. Has never happened. The majority of the court fears what has never happened, and the minority of the court fears what they have already seen happen in the Trump presidency. The Amy Coney Barrett, who joined the majority in the case, disagreed with the majority on one point, and that is the excluding any kind of evidence that involves an official act by the president. She raised the question of how that would destroy bribery prosecutions. She said this: excluding from trial any mention of the official act connected to the bribe would hamstring the prosecution to make sense of charges alleging a quid pro quo. The jury must be allowed to hear about both the quid and the quo. The presidential campaign is now the campaign of a former president who abused his power as president against the current president who has not abused that power and does not want any more power. Here is what President Biden said tonight about the Supreme Court opinion.
Good evening. The presidency is the most powerful office in the world. It's an office that not only tests your judgment, perhaps even more importantly, it's an office that tests your character. Because you not only face moments when you need the courage to exercise the full power of the presidency, you also face moments where you need the wisdom to respect the limits of the power of the office of the presidency. This nation was founded on the principle that there are no kings in America. Each of us is equal before the law. No one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. With today's Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, that fundamentally changed. For all practical purposes, today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what a president can do. This is a fundamentally new principle, and it's a dangerous precedent, because the power of the office will no longer be constrained by the law, even including the Supreme Court of the United States. The only limits will be self-imposed by the president alone. This decision today has continued the court's attack in recent years on a wide range of long-established legal principles in our nation, from gutting voting rights and civil rights, to taking away a woman's right to choose, to today's decision that undermines the rule of law of this nation. Nearly 4 years ago, my predecessor sent a violent mob to the U.S. Capitol to stop the peaceful transfer of power. We all saw it with our own eyes. We sat there and watched it happen that day. Attack on the police, the ransacking of the Capitol, a mob literally hunting down the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, gallows erected to hang the Vice President, Mike Pence. I think it's fair to say it's one of the darkest days in the history of America. Now the man who sent that mob to the U.S. Capitol is facing potential criminal conviction for what happened that day. And the American people deserve to have an answer in the courts before the upcoming election. The public has a right to know the answer about what happened on January 6th before they are asked to vote again this year. Now, because of today's decision, that is highly, highly unlikely. It's a terrible disservice to the people of this nation. So now the American people will have to do what the courts should have been willing to do, but will not. The American people have to render a judgment about Donald Trump's behavior. The American people must decide whether Donald Trump's assault on our democracy on January 6th makes him unfit for public office in the highest office in the land. The American people must decide if Trump's embrace of violence to preserve his power is acceptable. Perhaps most importantly, the American people must decide if they want to entrust the president once again, the presidency, to Donald Trump, now knowing he'll be even more emboldened to do whatever he pleases whenever he wants to do it. You know, at the outset of our nation, it was the character of George Washington, our first president, to define the presidency. He believed power was limited, not absolute, and that power always resides with the people, always. Now, over 200 years later, with today's Supreme Court decision, once again, it will depend on the character of the men and women who hold that presidency that are going to define the limits of the power of the presidency, because the law will no longer do it. I know I will respect the limits of the presidential powers I have for 3.5 years, but any president, including Donald Trump, will now be free to ignore the law. I concur with Justice Sotomayor's dissent today. Here's what she said. She said, in every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. With fear for our democracy, I dissent. End of quote. So should the American people dissent. I dissent. May God bless you all, and may God help preserve our democracy. Thank you. And may God protect our troops.
Why are you the best Democrat?
Yeah, I think so many of us during our lifetimes have come to expect so much of the court because we saw the court deliver in circumstances that proved the court's integrity. The Republican President Richard Nixon proved the Supreme Court's integrity, and now former Republican President Donald Trump has disproved it. Andrew, without that Supreme Court decision in the Nixon case, we wouldn't be sitting here so stunned tonight as we are.
Yeah, look, as we talked about off air, in many ways, this decision sort of quietly reverses the entire logic of the Nixon tapes case, because you have this broad recognition by the Supreme Court that anything that is within a very expansive view of the core functions or the take care clause of the Constitution is completely and 100% absolutely immune. And then even other official acts, there's a strong presumption where the court sets out a very difficult test to allow the government to go forward. But let me just make sure people understand, with respect to that core function where the court says it is absolutely immune, they say one of the things within that core function is the communications and the directions of the president and the Department of Justice. So they say that when a president orders sham prosecutions, he can do that and not face any criminal repercussions. Just to say it is to be shocked by it. I am completely with Neil. This is such a transformational decision. Finally, the tape that you played of President Biden is so remarkable because you have the sitting president saying, "I do not want that power. I should not have that power. That is not how our system works." The sitting president is saying this is not part of the checks and balances that we have in this country. We are not an autocracy. It is remarkable, just as an institutional and historical matter, that you have President Biden on the day of the decision saying, "I do not need and I should not have that power."
Melissa Murray, you clerked for Sonia Sotomayor. She made the point in her dissent that every president prior to Donald Trump, every one of them assumed that criminal law applied to them, every one of them. They were not inhibited in any way as presidents, as law-abiding people are not inhibited by the fact that law applies to them. How do you think Justice Sotomayor has been dealing with this opinion and the length of time it took to get it out? What was going on? What can you imagine going on inside the court to take this long?
Well, Lawrence, I don't think we have to imagine it. I think she told us a few weeks ago when she received the Radcliffe Medal in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she said that there are days where she goes back to her office and she cries because this court, of which she is a member, has done something so shocking, so beyond the pale, that it beggars belief. And I think this is one of those days. She chose to read her dissent from the bench. Again, that is an unusual step that they take only when they feel that it's really necessary to impress upon the public how monumental the majority's views are. She also, I think, quite rightly noted that this is a major hit to democracy. And she noted that she did not respectfully dissent. She simply dissented, noting the bad and sad times for democracy ahead. I wasn't entirely shocked by this decision. This is a Supreme Court that has had a 6-3 conservative supermajority for about 4 years. And in 3 of those 4 years, it has overruled a major precedent every single year. Dobbs in 2022, the affirmative action cases in 2023, the Chevron case this year. And now it's essentially abandoned Nixon versus United States. It's not done so explicitly, but this is a sub rosa overruling of Nixon. Who would have ever thought that we would be in a position like this, where the Supreme Court of the United States, so emboldened by its mere numbers, could simply run roughshod over the rule of law, over stare decisis, over existing precedents? That's what Donald Trump put in place. And I agree with Neil. I am surprised the Biden administration has not taken a more strident view about this court and its role in constructing the current landscape that we live in. But this is not just about the threat that Donald Trump poses to democracy. This court by itself is an existential threat to democracy.
I want to read Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's the conclusion of her opinion. She says, "The majority of my colleagues seem to have put their trust in our court's ability to prevent presidents from becoming kings through case-by-case application of the indeterminate standards of their new presidential accountability paradigm. I fear that they are wrong, but for all of our sakes, I hope that they are right. In the meantime, because the risks and power the court has now assumed are intolerable, unwarranted, and plainly antithetical to bedrock constitutional norms, I dissent. Dissent language doesn't get stronger than that.
Well, the language couldn't get stronger because it deserves to be enormously strong. That language was uttered just 3 days before Independence Day. In several days, we will celebrate the nation's survival of a revolution against kings and queens. We had a revolution so that we wouldn't have a king. And now the Supreme Court says, that's what we're giving you. I don't think we should accept that present, but it seems to me that all that does is basically put the court on the ballot this November. We have to decide whether we want the kind of government that Donald Trump has helped us have by appointing 3 members to this court, because 3 of the members of the majority were appointed by him, and 2 members of the majority ought to have recused themselves, Alito and Thomas. Mm-hmm. That's 5 justices. And it's those 5 who ultimately decided that even the evidence of official acts couldn't be used to show what the president was up to when he used his official powers. Because motive supposedly doesn't matter, but motive is everything. Whether a president gave a pardon in return for a bribe depends on whether he was doing it as a corrupt matter or whether he was giving a pardon because he thought someone deserved mercy. As Justice Barrett pointed out, you can't really make sense of the quid without the quo, and yet under the incoherent decision of the majority, you can prove the transfer of money, but you can't prove anything about the pardon that was given in exchange. That's the kind of thing that makes this decision so incoherent. And what makes it really dangerous is that even if we eventually get over Trumpism and the MAGA movement, we will have to rely on the good character of future presidents, because the law will no longer serve as a source of inhibition. That's dangerous. That's a prescription for autocracy and eventually for authoritarianism and dictatorship.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.